Hi, grade 4. We're going to do chapter 11 of Ticket to Curlew today. And you guys can just listen along and use your imagination to create pictures. All right, chapter 11. The small white horse and the tall black one stood side by side on the wagon road. The two boys looked at each other. "Hello," said Gregor. He smiled, but he looked puzzled. He pointed down the track and raised his eyebrows at Sam. "Hello," said Sam. He was thinking hard. If he could make Gregor understand about the strayed oxen, he might be able to help find them. Sam shaded his eyes and peered all around to show that he was searching for something. Then he pointed at Prince and at Gregor's horse and shook his head. He held up two fingers and hunched his shoulders, hoping he would look a little like an ox. Gregor looked puzzled. Sam pointed to himself and to the north side of the track. He drew the shape of a house in the air with his hand. Then he pointed to the south side of the track and drew another house. "Martingale," he said, and he looked hopefully at Gregor. Gregor nodded vigorously. "Martingale," he repeated. That was good, Sam thought, but not enough. There was only one thing to do. He slid off Prince's back and got down on his elbows and knees. Lowered his head, poked his fingers up above his ears to indicate horns, and slowly crawled down the track. After a minute, he looked up to see Gregor standing beside his horse, nodding and laughing. Sam stood up. He pointed in all directions, shrugged his shoulders, and held out empty hands to show loss. Gregor suddenly looked serious. Sam knew he finally understood. Gregor frowned for a moment. Then he said, "Sam!" He pointed his fingers above his ears like horns and said a word. Sam said, "Oxen? You mean oxen?" "Oxen," repeated Gregor. They stared at each other. It seemed that a whole world of communication had opened between them. "Oxen!" They both shouted and shook hands for the second time. Then Gregor stopped smiling. For a moment, he stood perfectly still with his eyebrows drawn together. Then he made a bowl shape with his hands and put his face into the bowl and lapped with his tongue. "Water?" said Sam. Gregor spread his arms to show that the bowl was now huge, wider than his arms could reach. He pointed to the southwest. Then he went back to lapping with his tongue. Sam was very excited. "You mean there's a pond down that way? You think oxen might be there?" Gregor picked out the only word he understood. "Oxen," he said firmly and pointed again to the southwest. Sam scrambled up on Prince. He looked at Gregor. "Will you show me?" he asked, holding his open palm toward the pond. He could now imagine it as clearly as if he had seen it himself. But Gregor looked uncertain. He pointed along the track to the west and said a word that sounded very much like "Papa." Sam knew what he was saying. He had to go home now. Sam shrugged and smiled, trying to show Gregor that he didn't mind, though he really did. Gregor smiled his wide smile. He made a beckoning gesture with his hand. He was saying, "Come with me." So Sam followed. He felt very shy as they rode up to the sod house. Gregor's father was on the roof of a long shed nailing poles in place. Sam thought that he was probably going to cover the poles with sod. Gregor went and spoke to him. The man did not smile at all, but Gregor kept explaining, pointing to Sam and in the direction of the pond. At last, Gregor's father nodded slowly, but Sam saw him look at the sun, which was nearing the horizon. Then he spoke firmly to Gregor. The tone of his voice made Sam think of his own father. Pa might come here looking for him, if only he could leave a message. When Gregor came over to him, nodding that they could go now, Sam made writing motions in the palm of his hand, pointed to Gregor and to his father, then to himself and to a tall, invisible figure next to him. Gregor made a face and shook his head. He understood, but they had no paper or pen. Sam thought a minute, got off Prince, and took up a sharp stone. He found a smooth patch of dusty earth near the track and scratched out a message. Pa, gone to look for oxen, not far. Sam. He hoped the not far part was true. Gregor looked at the message and nodded. He told his father about it, and the man looked at Sam with a small smile of approval. Then he went back to his pounding, and Sam and Gregor guided their horses across the track and started southwest. As they rode, the tall, dry grass brushed their boots, and a spray of grasshoppers rose before the horses' hoofs. The slanting late afternoon sunlight made everything golden. The boys couldn't talk to each other, but the sense that someone, a friend, was riding beside him filled Sam with excitement. It was as if they were setting off together on an adventure. The sky was still blue, but an edge of clouds along the horizon seemed to be rising to meet the sun. They were dark underneath and touched with gold above. Sam was just about to point them out to Gregor when his friend said, "Sam!" and pointed ahead of him by lifting his chin. Sam looked. He could see the tops of trees rising above the grass. In just a few minutes, they were riding down a short slope. There, in a big hollow in the prairie, was a small pond, deep blue like the sky above it. There were reeds all around its edges, showing that in spring the pond would be much bigger. Small willows grew in clumps at the edge of the reeds, and, standing knee-deep in the blue water, were 2 large brown oxen. Sam reached out and slapped Gregor on the back. Picture. "You were right," he said. "The martingales will be so happy." Gregor looked pleased, but he didn't smile. He was staring at the oxen. Sam looked at the huge beast again and realized that finding the oxen was just the first step. Now they had to get them out of the pond and home. He had rope wound around his waist, but he could not believe that those oxen would follow him if he tried to lead them out of a place where they seemed so content. Suddenly, he realized that Gregor was off his horse. He was striding through the reeds and into the shallow water. He slapped the oxen on their large rumps and spoke to them in a quiet, firm voice. To Sam's amazement, the animals turned toward shore and walked out of the water, sending waves across the pond. Sam slid off Prince. He handed the rope to Gregor, who quickly tied an end to the harness on each ox. He looked at the long rope with an ox at each end and made a face. Sam had an answer to that problem. He took out his pocket knife and cut the rope in the middle. Now they could get back on their horses and each lead 1 ox. When they got to the top of the hill, Sam looked back at the little pond. The water was golden now. It shone in the midst of the darkening prairie. Sam had the feeling that it would disappear as soon as they could no longer see it. He looked around him. The sky was filled with golden clouds that seemed to catch fire in the west near the setting sun. Gregor laid the reins on his horse's neck, and still, holding the end of the rope, he stretched his arms wide as if he wanted to touch the pale gold sky to the east and the blazing orange sky to the west. Then he picked up the reins and moved restlessly on the horse's back. Sam knew what he meant. He wanted to make his horse fly across the darkening land. So did Sam. But instead, they walked slowly and steadily, with the oxen plodding behind. As they neared the track, Sam saw Pa riding towards them. "Good for you, boys," he said. "You've done a good job. The martingales will certainly think so, too." "It was really Gregor, Pa," said Sam. "He guessed where the oxen might be, and he knew how to get them out of the pond." "Thank you, Gregor," said Pa. "Thank you from the martingales." Gregor looked pleased. He gestured toward Sam as if to say, "You deserve some credit, too." But Sam just shook his head. As they rode along the track, Sam said to Pa, "I guess you found my message?" "I did," said Pa. "Gregor's father made sure I saw it. He seemed to think you were a smart young fellow." How Pa could know what Gregor's father thought, Sam had no idea. But when they came to Gregor's place, there was his whole family out in the yard to greet them. The dogs barked, the younger children waved, and Gregor's mother smiled. Gregor's father came over to Sam and Pa. He put his hand on his chest. "Ivan Chomik," he said. Pa held out his hand. "James Ferrier," he said, "and Sam Ferrier." Mr. Chomik put both of his hands around Pa's and shook hard. Then he stepped back toward his family. Gregor handed Pa the rope he was still holding. He knew that the farriers had to be starting home. It was nearly dark and it would be a slow journey with the oxen. Sam and Pa rode in silence for a few minutes. The wind had blown the clouds away and the stars were starting to show themselves. Pa looked up and said, "This country grows on you, Sam." "I admit it can seem lonely, but it grows on you. I guess you're not so lonely now." "No," said Sam. Besides his whole family, there was Gregor and Prince, especially Prince. Prince was always there, ready to go with him, needing no words. Gregor was a friend, but they did need words. Sam had to figure out what to do about that.